Hey guys, this is Calm. I'm doing the 12th round, I guess now, of the World Rapid Championship 2013, following Mamedyarov's games. Mamedyarov is white in this game against Nikita Fityugov, who, I can tell from these standings, is 27-19, Russian player. So yeah, actually I found this, so let's look at the current standings. So it's about to be round 12, spoilers. But I'd imagine what is very close. Yeah, so I think he's basically tied with a few other people. So he'd be looking to win all his games from here on out. To have any chance of really winning the championship. So let's see if he manages to do that. D4, E6. This is kind of a delayed way to get into a lot of openings. Obviously C4, D5 is kind of just Queen's Gambit declined. You can use it to play a Dutch defense after C4, F5, which is arguably safer because it avoids some of the sidelines, like after 1 F5 you can play 2 Bishop G5, or you can play lines with 2 Knight C3, 3 E4, or even just E4 and then F3, like all the sack lines. You can, but the problem is you have to also be able to play the French as black against E4, because obviously white can play 2 E4 here. So it's kind of a move order which is only really viable if you play the French. But if you do play the French and the Dutch, then it's kind of the perfect move order for you. So just C4. And Bishop E4 check is played. So it's kind of a I mean, it's a BOGO Indian, but it's, you know, I would say not the optimal move order. Generally speaking, if you want to play Nimzo Indian, you play Knight F6 first, and then after Knight C3 you play this. Or if after Knight F6, Knight F3, Bishop B4, that's kind of the more normal way to get into the opening. As it is, it will probably just transpose, but I don't know, because it's less commonly played, it looks a bit weird to me. There's probably nothing wrong with that, it's just my personal feelings on it. I guess the advantages can be that after this, you can then play F5 if you have Knight C3 played against you, and then you can establish this Knight on E4 with the F5 support, which you couldn't do if you played 2 Knight F6. That might be the reasoning for the black's move order, but I think you can also run into some weird lines where it kind of changes a bit with like Knight D2 or Bishop D2, which otherwise wouldn't be played because you get this Knight C3 move, so pluses and minuses. Bishop D2 is played, takes. I like the take with the queen here because you want this knight behind the pawn on C3, controls more central squares compared to Knight D2 would control E4 but not D5. Knight F6, Knight C3, D5, playing for the centre. Normal development would just be E3, Knight F3, Bishop D3, castles, that kind of thing. But given we've already got a queen on D2, we might be tempted with something like Queen G5 or something, just so it's not locked behind our own pawns. Knight F3, castles, Queen. Okay, Queen F4. So I guess this helps support D4. Compared to a move like Queen G5, which I suggested was more a kind of last move kind of thing, because it put pressure on G7. Although arguably that wouldn't have done much, because just castles obviously protects G7 enough. Queen E7, E3. I guess the idea is that white is not really fearing Queen B4, because he can just play Rook B1 or something, and if takes on C4 it's not really an issue because you can play takes on C7 and then retake on C4 next move. A6 is played, A3, I guess to stop Queen B4, because in that line I just mentioned after A6 you'd then be able to play B5 next move to support the C4 pawn. Rook E8, Rook C1, Knight C6. Putting this knight in front of the pawns is kind of not something you really want to do, because it blocks the c-pawn moving forwards. But maybe he thinks he can never really contest the c-file, as white's already established his rook there. He's done that via not spending the time to castle, which is a bit risky. But I guess that's just kind of the way the line plays out. Knight c6, knight e5, immediately contesting it. I'd imagine bishop d7 here, because we don't really want to allow the takes and the doubling of the c-pawns, because then c5 could be played by black. And this would be really strong, because there's no way to ever contest this with a d-pawn or a b-pawn. So we just have a really, good passed pawn, which blockades two of black's pawns. So it'd be essentially like white is playing a pawn up. Bishop d7 is played. And now just taking on d5. Again, it's like really simple play, which is what I like about Mamedyarov. His rook is on c1, and it's blockaded by his own pawn, so he just takes on d5. He doesn't worry about trying to push in the c5 immediately or anything to get some extra queenside pressure. He's just trying to make his pieces the best they can be as immediately as possible. So it seems very simple, but he gets great results with it. He takes d5. I especially think his style is really good in these rapid tournaments, because if you're playing simply, it's harder to make mistakes, whereas if you're a really tactical player, then there's going to be errors on both sides. Here you can play almost perfectly if this is kind of your normal game. Everything's just a little sped up, but it's going to affect them more than you if this is your normal style. And they're going to struggle to make plans and stuff, especially if they're tactical players, because playing simply eliminates a lot of the tactics in their normal game, I would guess. Knight d3 back. You could take on d7 here, and after queen takes, we've got one bishop against 0, so after bishop d3 I think white would have a little edge. You could take on c6, but I don't like that because a bishop takes, and then black's pawn structure is fine. He has enough control over e4 and blockades c6 enough so that this rook doesn't do much. So playing back to knight d3 kind of indicates to me that he's really going to play for a win in this game. He's trying to keep material on so that he can better use it later on. So with this knight d3 move in particular, he's looking for knight c5, which would put pressure on this b7 pawn. He's also immediately attacking c7 via his queen, although we can't really take that because that would be allowing knight takes d4, and we can take back because of this queen. But it's good, it's interesting. I'm wondering what we do after knight h5. I guess it's just queen f3, and after knight takes d4 this would hang, so that's his kind of response to that. It's just rook a d8 is played. Black not worrying about the c7 pawn because of that knight takes d4. He would also lose his b7 pawn, but presumably he'd think he'd have enough pressure that the time would be compensated well. He could play rook b8 back, it hits the queen. Yeah, he can take an a6, but then b2 is very weak. It's protected by this knight at the moment, but after something like bishop f5, white's position would kind of crumble, and it's very risky with the king still in the centre. So bishop e2 is played, simple. Probably the safest move, probably the move I'd have made as well. You're more likely to see a computer go after this pawn than a person, just because you have to work out the complications. And in rapid games, you generally want to play I think like this, like simply, so that you don't end up using all your time early on in moves where probably the difference between the moves in terms of the actual value they bring is small. Bishop c8, castles, rook d6. So black is planning to bring his rook over to the h-file or the g-file and just get some attack on white's king. I don't think that will particularly work out because we have enough pieces around here to cover, but it's kind of multi-purpose, and it also helps defend c6, and it blockades against the queen hitting the c7 pawn. So okay. Queen h4. Queen f8. I guess black doesn't want to trade queens with the knight move, because then white would just be able to play with the pieces, and losing the queens here isn't that much of a deficit for white because his play is mainly positional along this c-file. He's going to go for, doubling up rooks on this c-file, and then because of this knight being in the way, he's going to push b4, a4, b5 to eventually break it open and try and take this c-pawn. That's going to be his long-term plan, and if he gets rid of the queens here, this queen isn't really supporting this pawn push over here. It's kind of locked out of it. Whereas this pawn is supporting in the can support in the defensive if this rook moves. So that could be why. Bishop f3, just adding more central support. Stops a lot of knight takes d4 tricks if this knight ever moves. And now knight's coming over to the king side. The other advantage of this knight move here is that it allows black to play c6 in future to prevent against this weak c-pawn. So actually it seems that black's managed to entangle himself quickly enough whereby he's not going to have too much pressure on this file for the time being. Rook e1, normal development. Hits the queen, so he moves it. c6 is played. The thing that is weak in black's position is these dark squares like b6 and c5. You could put knights on both of them, and it would basically cramp up black quite a lot. b4 is played. Knight e4. We decide to give the bishop for it, which in a position where it's very cramped, that's probably a good decision, because black's pawns are already on light squares here, so our bishop can't do much along this diagonal, and leaving his knight on e4 would be really dangerous because it's so centrally placed. So we pretty much have to give it, and then after the captures I imagine we're going to reroute this knight to c4, which is a good square, or we could put it immediately on c5, which might actually be better because it's immediately hitting this, and then later on we can later move this knight to a4 to b2 to c4. This is getting a lot of central play with our knights, which is nice to have. f5 is played, so black's kind of going to work against this slow queenside pressure by having very quick kingside pressure. Generally you want to open up the position when you have bishops compared to knights, and black's the only one who has a bishop here, so that makes sense. He's also protecting e4, which was important. The knight comes back, now it's looking to go to f4 to kind of stop this pressure, whereas this queenside pressure can kind of come 100 moves down the line. This is coming very quickly, so it's more of an immediate threat. Queen e7, a4, b6. So this weakens c6. This is kind of a weird move in my opinion. But I guess he just wants to use this e6 square, and he doesn't want to trade for the knight. So knight goes back, bishop e6, knight d2, aiming for c4, and bishop d5. Okay, so managing to do this, that justifies his b6 move. I don't see this whole plan, but given that he's managed to just improve his bishop to still support this pawn, I think is good. He just has to be careful that the pressure white can bring isn't enough to kind of override this bishop's defense on it. Knight c4 is played, and then he just takes. Okay, so I don't like b6 again because this is weak again, because he pretty much had to give this bishop. So I'm going back to my original assessment of I don't like b6. I think white is quite a nice position to play now because his pawns are very structured and organised, and there's no obvious targets. Whereas this c6 is a huge target for, well, weakness in black's position. So I can just gang up on that again, simple play. Now h4. So h4 is good because what he's planning to do is move his knight into f4, but he doesn't want to do it in a position where he's going to trade. If he trades, then it's likely the three major pieces for the three major pieces is just going to balance out. It's not going to be a way to break through against it. So he's going to try and get his knight into the position somehow. And if he can get his knight, well, ideally e5, but I don't really see how you can get it there at the moment. But if you had this knight on e5 and this knight wasn't here, that would be another attack on c6, which would be enough to break through. So h4, the idea of h5 is quite nice because you can support this h5 pawn via knight f4, and it gives some space for the king, which is potentially needed later on, although not really, I'd say. There's no real risk of back rank mates at the moment. So knight f8 moves back preemptively. I'd imagine we just play h5 still, because we don't want rook g6 to come in. It's played. Now this knight is rerouting to different square. Okay, so we drop our rook back. I'm not sure why we do that. Yeah, okay, I don't really understand this move, so I can't really comment on it. Normally I try to make a guess at most moves, as you can tell. So rook h6, I mentioned knight f4. Okay, queen f4. So the idea is if it takes on h5, he's playing knight g3, and then that would hit this rook moves, and then you can take on f5 with it. That would also weaken e4, so I guess it's good if it pays off. And also, black is unable to play g6 to support this pawn, because this would hang. And if you play g5 immediately, to hit this queen, you could just play queen takes f5. It's queen f7, knight g3, and now he's played rook h to f6 because he wants to support this pawn, which is pretty important. Although thinking about it, you'd be able to. I think you can still take on f5, because if you take on f5, rook takes f5, this rook hangs on d6. So maybe the idea is that after knight takes f5, you can play rook e6, maybe. So this rook is just moving, and then this knight is pinned to the queen. But I think you could support it with pawn to g4, and this, pawn to g6 kind of exploiting the pin of the knight and the queen doesn't really work, because you have knight h6 check in those lines, which picks up the queen. Okay, so he did play it. So I think what I just said was right. And yeah, he's gone for taking on h5 instead, so he's not quite giving up his d6 rook for the knight, because obviously if he takes it now, rook takes f4. But I would be tempted to play queen takes d6 instead and pick up the two rooks for the queen, because generally speaking that's a bit of a better trade. Although you mainly only see it in really late game positions where there's no pawns left, so it generally works out about equal. But here I think we would have enough pressure on these c pawns to whereby we can make this a pass pawn, which I think should be enough to win, because if you've got the rooks and a pass pawn, you can always roost the rooks to protect and keep advancing it, as long as your king is safe enough, which this king is, as long as this rook stays on the first rank. So I'm not sure, maybe white might have an easier way to play, like a knight g3 or something, attacking this queen, and if rook takes, knight takes, and just rook move and knight f4, because then you still have a lot of pressure on c6 and you wouldn't have to go to that material imbalance. But we'll see. Okay, he does go for this. Cool. Knight f6 is played, there's no way to defend this, so he's just giving it up. Okay, but white doesn't take immediately. The idea with this move is he's trying to advance his pawns quicker and get to that pass pawn quicker, because if pawn takes here, we have rook c8, which is going to be mate, because the knight blocks his exit square. I mean, he can play knight takes, but then rook takes, and it's over. So he has to play a takes if he's taking, and then after a takes, he has the same situation. So what he's trying to do is be able to put one of these two pawns on c6 by taking on c6, and that's going to be a very strong passer because it's already supported by these two rooks, And again, there's no kingside weakness because this rook's on the first rank. It just has to be careful against knight g4, queen h2, I guess. But then, arguably, you can just hide on e2 anyway. So b5 is played. Takes. Knight g4. And he just does check take here. So unless black is able to mate white now, he's going to lose, because there's no way for his knight to get back in time. And if he gives his queen for it, obviously, the material difference is too much. So check is played. Another check is played. Takes on g2. So he's starting to take on f2 next, after rook f1. Seems to cover everything. So, I think it's pretty much over. Okay, he actually plays knight takes e4 instead. And after queen takes e4, he's just going to be able to play c7 and then c8 check. It's actually just even more efficient, I guess. And there's no more moves. So, yeah, white wins again. Mamedyarov is doing well. Yes, that was round 12. I think we have 3 more rounds to go. And I think at this point in the tournament, it's pretty much all tied up between 3 or 4 of them. So he's going to really be looking for wins in the last few games. Okay, so hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in round 13.